people had the time, so the only way can keep their mind busy is looking at things and make a story out of it. There's a lot of story that I know. Not nowadays. I don't think we have that kind of time to think like that.
This is a story with a timeless theme. A people dispossessed, deep historic wounds, and still unresolved conflict. On one side, ongoing suffering and a desire for justice. On the other, a mixture of denial and guilt. This is 21st century Canada, and this is a story with a question mark. Is there a way forward? Thousands of years before Europeans first set foot in the northern part of the North American continent, diverse native peoples occupied these lands, each with their own tribal territory that provided the resources for survival. The arrival of Europeans first disrupted, then devastated these First Nations. European colonization reached the Northwest in the early 19th century. The land, now known as British Columbia, was home to between 250,000 and 400,000 native people at that time. Our story captures the impacts of this contagion of colonization on two sub-tribes of the Carrier people, the Burns Lake Band and the Cheslatta Carrier Nation, who live in the north-central interior. It's a story of Canada's shame and its promise.
Historically, the Cheslatta have lived in the modern-day vicinity of Tweedsmuir Park in a circle lake system. There was a series of lakes and rivers approximately 50, 60 miles south of Burns Lake.
It was a unified community, a community where they had an organized way of life.
They had a hereditary chief system and a clan system. There's 4 clans at Cheslatta: the caribou, the frog, the bear, and the beaver.
Well, them days, people, they used to trapping, fishing, everything like that.
It's very clear that the Cheslatta people were very fiercely independent.
Yeah, the life was free down there. There's no cops or game warden to bother us. We live off the land.
And they had different village sites and campsites, hunting areas, trapping areas, berry picking areas, so they used different parts of the land different times of the year. They had trails galore. When we started doing a mapping project with the elders back in 1983, we sat down with maps, and the people weren't used to looking at a paper map. But once they got accustomed to this lake and that lake, and they started drawing these trails and cabins and campsites. And they had land and water routes. They had dugout canoes throughout the whole territory. They would paddle until they got to where they were going and leave the canoe, walk overland, and there would be another canoe there. And so they had hundreds of these little canoes. And they would travel. There was always legends of who could travel the farthest and the fastest. And those stories are still told today.
The arrival of European settlers imposed a new story on this landscape. Europeans brought diseases like smallpox that decimated the pre-contact population by a staggering 90%. But even more devastating to the native world was the process of colonization that brought into being a European settler society. The settlers imposed 3 kinds of control over native life: the reserve system of Indian lands, the Indian Act, and the residential school system. In the eyes of colonisers, natives stood in the way of progress and development. These settlers, who came with their own dreams of a better life ahead, saw themselves as moving into an empty land. Their right to occupy and own this land, justified by 19th century ideas of racial and cultural superiority, was the basis for the reserve system, which confined natives to tiny patches of marginal land. Natives were now trespassers on their former lands and reduced to poverty for lack of a land base.
All aspects of reserve life were embedded in part within the Indian Act. And in that sense, the Indian Act was the vehicle by which generations of First Nations people had to adapt or die.
The Indian Act, and learning from it from a political standpoint and wondering why there was another country within my country.
I've heard it from so many sources that when South Africa was looking for precedents for establishing the apartheid system, that a delegation was sent to Canada and the Indian Act was studied extensively and used as a model for some of the apartheid legislation.
Under this act, independent tribal nations now became dependent wards of the state, not permitted to manage their own reserve lands or money, and pushed into a culture of dependence on the Department of Indian Affairs. From the 1880s on, the department appointed Indian agents who were sent to every reserve across Canada to supervise virtually every aspect of native life.
An Indian agent really does have a terrible, terrible reputation amongst First Nations, because they were in many ways almost the local lord of the manor. That was still the period when many First Nations were evolving from a more traditional form of life into a more settled, permanently anchored kind of life. And to go from speaking their own language to having to deal with people in a totally foreign language, who now had the ability to determine whether or not you had a home, whether your children went to school, whether they were grabbed and sent away to residential schools.
Indian agents, along with priests and police, went to the reserves and forced parents to send their children to residential school. The residential school system was a partnership between the churches and the state, and the cornerstone of assimilation policy. The intent, according to official documents, was to kill the Indian in the native child. The direct attack on native language and spirituality was pure cultural genocide.
My son, when they took you away, you were so young and strong. I just couldn't wait for the day to have you back home where you belong. The only thing that kept me alive was knowing I would see you again. There was no way for me to know you'd come back. Oh man, I don't know.
They took me to the jock when I was 7. When I got there, I had a culture shock. I started screaming. That's part of culture shock, when you scream, crying. Then they gave me a number. And that number, I can never forget it. I still think about it, number 13. When I got there, I had culture shock. I can't go hunting anymore, I can't go fishing no more.
The first night I was traumatized. I was scared. I didn't even know any of the girls. You cannot speak your Indian language or anything like that. And that's the only language we know.
I don't speak my language fluently, and my mother refused to teach me because she suffered horribly for speaking her language. And she's seen people get their heads shaved, needles put in their tongue, being forced to kneel for hours holding Bibles up for speaking their language.
My mum was fluent in 3 dialects. Yeah, they never taught us any of the language. My grandma was fluent. But to them it was better we didn't know. The residential school had a huge impact on them.
Oh, it's like a magical experience in a way. I became disconnected from my family, from my community, from my culture, and put into an institution.
When you don't bond with family members, you don't know them personally.
Knowing that there is a family, but not feeling it.
It's like I live like on an island by myself. I feel like a stranger to relatives, and it's made my life a living hell.
My son, where did you go when they took you away? My son, where did you go when they took you away? I don't recognize you anymore. The scars of life are deeper than before.
When your self-worth is messed up as a kid, your own value as a human being is messed up as a child, and no one has made any effort to heal that or debrief that or anything. And we carry that, and if you have children, you're going to pass it on to your children. There's no getting away from that. Our children will watch you as they're growing up, and if they see fear in you or anger or the sad depression state in you, they're influenced by that.
Well, I know when I was growing up, my dad would be strict with us, and then I'd always wonder why he was like that, because we didn't even do nothing. And then now I realized it was because of the residential school.
I think I was pretty rough with my kids sometimes. It's just the way they were raised in Jack. I know where I went wrong. I had no business touching, strapping them or anything.
I admit, and I know, that at certain times I was a bad parent. If I could turn the pages back, I could, but I can't.
Mother, when I went away, I looked back to my home. You know I really wanted to stay when I thought of you there all alone. The only thing that kept me alive was knowing I would see you again. There was no way for me to know I'd come back to an alcoholic home.
Because people don't want to talk about this. They don't want to talk about kids being sexually abused by a group of adults. No one wants to hear this, and they don't want to hear it, so they don't want to hear what happens to that individual.
There's so many secrets still out there that need to be dealt with.
Because I became suicidal because of my abuse. I'd wake up every morning wanting to die for a while in her life. Just wanted to die. wanted to shoot myself. That is what I'd think of. So I'm starting to learn about trauma. And I discovered that the word trauma means to be pierced. And where does an individual get pierced to where, it affects them if they get triggered? It means that all of a sudden the memory becomes real again because a sound or a scent or a date or anything that a date and time like September or December or something happens, and they go back to that time of being pierced or being traumatized. So they get traumatized in their mind, their body, or their spirit.
People that I know today are still feeling the effects because they get into drugs and alcohol, and it's addictions that they get into.
And when I experienced alcohol, everything was gone. And when I got to the drugs, it was even more intense. So I got hooked on it. I became addicted.
Mother, where did you go when they took me away? Mother, where did you go when they took me away? I don't recognize you anymore. The scars of life are deeper than before.
The residential schools played a major role in the lives of the First Nations peoples. Pros and cons, absolutely. And there was an opportunity for several of the students, of the young children, to go into a residential school to learn how to eat properly, to be clean, to look after themselves, how to just function. And this is a capacity which was not available to them at home.
I feel the dysfunction, that we're experiencing today comes from the residential school. It was a breeding ground for dysfunction.
The residential schools did provide an opportunity for First Nations people, for First Nations children, to have an education, to be able to learn and develop, and be able to cope with adulthood.
How could this be? How could someone plan to kill a lot of people or take kids for this reason? To assimilate. It's like everyone else when I first heard residential school, and after I went through the thing, it was about education. It was about bettering us as a people. And then when I started to know the history of residential school through the court cases, I started to see that there was an ulterior motive that brought a lot of dysfunction to us. This whole business was to assimilate us, to destroy the culture. And the word culture means a way of life, which means language, dress, food, spiritual practices, everything, was to destroy that, was to assimilate us into European way of thinking.
I'd like to see some of the First Nations leaders look at it this way, that it was not all negative. And yes, there may have been some losses as far as language skills and that sort of thing, but then think of the positives, think of the educational opportunities that they've had that they would not otherwise have had.
They gotta have education. Gotta be good education. Not like Jack. Jack is just Catholic. No good.
I'd like to compliment the people that made those decisions in those days, because that was part of the solution.
When we were identified in history books as the Indian problem, what should we do? Well, the first thing was they made the reservations, called them lands reserved for Indians. And after that, they put in a residential school system, to speed up the process.
People were doing what they thought was right at the time, and that was part of the assistance that they were offering to First Nations.
To still see today Canadians say, get over it. I say, oh, gee, you're going to never know how it feels to be messed up in the mind, in the body, in the spirit, all at once. And because you don't go there, and you've never been there, most of you have not been there as Canadians, how do you know it? It's easy for you to say, get over it. It's so easy. If you haven't been traumatized as a nation.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country. The government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential schools policy were profoundly negative, and that this policy has had a lasting and damaging impact on Aboriginal culture, heritage, and language.